Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar, Soundcraft Vi1000 Monitor Training, presented by Gabriel Le Roux. My name is Laura Lawrence and I'm the Global Marketing Director at Harman. So just a few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels during the webinar. However, there is a chat function where you can submit questions to the presenter and they'll try to answer as many questions as possible at the end. This webinar will also be recorded and the link will be made available a few days after the presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control, and we'd like to encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Session Workshop series on pro.harman.com, as well as visiting Harman Professional University to see our many on-demand and certification courses that are always available to you for free. And now I'd like to introduce you to Gabriel Le Roux, the presenter for today's webinar. Gabriel is a professional monitor and recording engineer based in Johannesburg, South Africa. Gabriel's 17 years of industry experience includes studio work, large-scale live sound production, broadcast integration for Studer, and training and product support for Soundcraft South Africa. And now I'm going to pass it over to you, Gabriel.
Great, thank you, Laura. Appreciate that introduction. Welcome, everyone. So today is my third and final lecture on Soundcraft VI. If you've missed the previous two, so we did the first one, and it's obviously, as Laura said, it's available on the YouTube channel. It was basic features. So if you have got previous digital console experience and would like to learn about the VI, that's a good place to start. We did a second session that followed on that looked more to advanced features. So features you would use once you have got the basics down. And then obviously today, a topic I love to talk about is Talkback and Monitoring. Being a monitor engineer and primarily mixing in-ears, I wanted to find a way to do my workflow as easy and simple as possible, but still be able to follow the show. So at the end of the session, I'm going to talk a little bit of how I actually approach a large-scale show and where there's a lot of talkback and comms going. So we're going to look into that. But first, we're going to look at the features that enable us to do that. So topics for today is going to primarily only be on talkback and monitoring and how the two tie together. So we're going to just look to the oscillator because it's under the that feature set as well. We're going to look at the talkback section, what features are available for us there. We're going to look at a feature called Talkback Assignment. We're going to then move over to the monitor section and solo blend, solo trim, input priority, and then obviously I'm going to go over to a little bit of a demo showing how I would approach or how do I approach my shows. So takeaways for today, understandings is obviously talkback options, understanding all of them and how to implement them, monitor options, how to implement them, and also to speed up your workflow if you're a monitor engineer. And obviously the demo right at the end. A little bit about myself. I'm going to just skip over this because I've done it twice already. Monitor engineer from South Africa, as Laura said. There's a few photos of shows that I've done, some of the more recent ones. As Laura said, I'm a recording engineer as well, so we do recordings where there's large channel counts, like 150 higher, and obviously I do some festivals and quite a bit of variety shows, which are interesting because the talkback on these type shows are very intense. There's quite a lot happening. One of my other passions is signal integration. How do we make different pieces of hardware work together, talk to each other when it comes to maybe triggering them via MIDI or via timecode, or distributing signal at different sample rates. This is something I can talk about for a long time. Here's a design that I did for a show called Afrikaans Groot, where the one half of the setup was running at 48K and the other half at 96K, and all kinds of interesting stuff happening there. So let's jump right in. We've got an hour. So firstly, we're going to jump to the talkback section. So to the top right of the console. And as you can see on this little slide there is an XLR input, a level, and then at the bottom three buttons there are your preset buttons. There's a button called external, internal, and obviously setup takes us into that menu. So we're going to spend a bit of time there now. I'm going to switch over to our virtual VI, which is the offline editor, if you don't know it. I've linked it to a Vi1000 via a technology called mirroring. So whatever I'm doing on, for instance, you can see I'm selecting some buttons on my channels, they will replicate on the offline editor. This is just a nice way of following the feature sets. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our Talkback function right at the top here, and we're going to go into our setup. So as you can see, the oscillator is also under the Talkback menu or setup menu. We have, when it comes to oscillator, we can choose whether we want to use pink noise, whether we want to use white noise, use a sine, and for the sine wave, there's a frequency adjust to make the frequency higher or softer. We can then also send it to a bus and to Talkback as well. So when this section is lit up yellow, it means the Talkback function is on, even though it's not at the moment sending to any buses. This is important to understand because, I'm going to stop my playback for a second for this demo. When this is on every single channel, we have within our input section, we can decide whether we want to listen to input 1 or 2, but there's also an oscillator. So if I go to the first channel, it's called David. I'm going to switch it on. And then if I select that channel, we can now hear that that oscillator is coming into that first channel. If we go to our metering as well, you'll see the audio is passing them. So let's quickly look at, so obviously we can decide whether we want pink noise or white noise and sine wave, of which we can change the frequency. And that is the overall on or off. Important to know this because I'll show you a little bit later where I actually use it within my monitor setup, which is an interesting application. Then within our Talkback setup, we can obviously then send to a bus. This is how we would normally test our monitors or our in-ears. We can just select them and they are now sending to our mixers. So in this case, it's going to mix 1 to 8. I've mentioned this before, if you've watched any of the previous sessions, is wherever we do routing, there's always this button that says none, which makes it easy to unpatch everything. On the screen, this is something I can't do in the offline editor, but on the screen you can also just drag your finger. I'll demo this a little bit later. You can drag your finger over these buttons and it will select them as well. When it comes to stereo buses, in this case AUXes, excuse me, when you click it the first time, it sends to left and right. When you click it a second time, it only goes to left and then to right. When it's a mono aux like aux 9, it's only on and off. And then when you want to deselect all of them, you can just push none. Very simple to use. The only thing to remember is this button, oscillator to bus, needs to be on, regardless of whether it's aux, a group, or a matrix. This allows you obviously to set it up, and then whenever you want to test your monitors, you can just then toggle the switch on and off. There's an additional feature here that's called Oscillator to Talkback. This is a setup function. So if you're sending this to your external out, I'm going to talk about this in depth now. It's a feature called external, which is a direct out of our Talkback mic. We can switch it on. I have to be careful now because this is going to the sub mixer. Oops, very loud. So when I switch it on, it then goes to the direct out selected, assigned to that external out. I'll explain this in detail in a moment. We're going to then move over to all our Talkback features. Is this section here in purple. So the simplest way to set up Talkback between the monitor console, for instance, or the front of house console and your buses is to use the presets. So there's 3 presets, and they've been built to send to buses. And at the bottom here is where we'll set them up. So I'm just going to go into preset 1. And very simply, you just click the buses you want to send to. In this case, I have set up preset 1 to talk to David, Lee, and Rob, which are my presenters. The playback session I'm using is a comedy show. We did it that way because speech is passing better via WebEx than music. And it's for the demos, it just helps us. Then preset 2, I made all our guests. And preset 3 is going to left. And there's a very good reason why. You can obviously just keep in mind, if you're doing a show, a small show, and you want to use your Talkback mic, for instance, for an evacuation mic, or if that's a requirement of the show, or a backup evacuation mic, you can always assign that Talkback mic to left and right. So very simply, to get Talkback going, we hit select, we select a preset, we say where we want to send it, and that's it. When we don't have, I just need to actually go back to, the only way to explain this is to go to this top view. On the console, we've got an XLR in the front there. Whenever we plug a microphone in there and we dial it up and we assign something to the preset, the Talkback will work immediately. In this case, what I've done is I'm using a different Talkback source. So you can see there's no microphone plugged in, and I'll explain that now. It works like this. You can decide where you want to grab your Talkback from, and it's very easy to change. So in a scenario where you don't have a Talkback setup, you can then grab any wireless mics, for instance, open up this patch point, and then change, say the wireless mic was coming in on mic 1, just click it, and then if you select preset 1, our Talkback then will go obviously to the buses set to preset 1. In my case, I have used AS1 is my Talkback source. Originally, I plugged my Talkback mic into mic 1, but I wanted to apply an EQ, so I went out of the console and back, and thus the EQ'd signal coming back into the console is AS1. That's why it's a little bit odd. So I've got a Talkback mic here. Whenever I now select my preset, say I select preset 1, it's going to my presenters. You can see the signal jumping up and down there. You'll be able to hear it. If I select one of those buses, preset 2, it's going to my guests. And then I am using my third preset button to talk to my technicians. In this case, it's going left. This will make a bit more sense when I come to my demo and why I've done it that way. Then we've got 2 buttons left at the top here. So the console allows us to make a connection between 2 VIs, for instance, or 2 different consoles, front of house and a monitor console, without using any of our buses or channels. That's why you can plug the mic straight in there, dial up the gain, and you're ready to go. Obviously, in different scenarios, you might want to do something else, so they've made provision for it. In this case, we're going to pretend that we're using the external out to go to a front of house console. It's just this button here. To use this, and this is a good thing to know, this is just like a T-piece, basically. As soon as you push this button, the signal coming in at the top is then going out of a specific output. The output can be assigned to any of the outs. It can be an analog out, or if you've made a Dante connection between your monitor and front of house console, you can also do that. In my case, I am using output 23. And output 23 is also plugged into my summing mixer that receives this mic that I'm talking on now. I've done a bit of a different EQ just to demonstrate that the signal is coming from there. Oh, and the generator is still on. Sorry about that. There we go. It's this guy here. 222. Then there's another feature called internal. So this also allows you to internally route to one aux at a time, which is a very, very handy feature. To use this feature, you have to flip your Vistonics under this menu here. So our options are solo select, our ons and offs. So this represents our aux masters. As you can see at the bottom, it says aux 9 to 18. I've labeled the auxes in the top already. In the same way the wireless mics would have been labeled. Then there's another button called Talkback Assign. So when I push internal here, this allows me to route the microphone internally to a specific bus. So I'm tapping the microphone and you can see on the metering it's coming up on 8. We can do multiple ones. So now it's going to the last 4 within that bank. aux 5, 6, 7, and 8. And it will remember our last selection, obviously, until we restart the console. So what I normally use my internal Talkback function for is when I've set up a preset. So say preset 1 is talking to all my vocalists. Every now and then you want to only talk to one of your vocalists and not all of them, because maybe it's going to cause some confusion. So what you can do then is, instead of now going back here and editing this, you can use the internal function and just select the one person you want to talk to. Say you want to talk to this person called Lee, and there we go. That's it. Very simple. In a festival scenario, I normally leave this on my drummer. On my drummer's aux, which means if I want to get the sound check going and the rest of the band still setting up, I will talk to him, and then the rest of the band don't feel like I'm putting pressure on them, but maybe I can see he's ready for a sound check. So I'll tell him, listen, whenever you're ready, please give us a kick. So with one source, we can very easily then set up 5 different Talkback destinations. I'll show you in my demo how I also use the mic to add a 6th one. And in most scenarios, I found that 6 is normally enough to get the job done. Great. Okay, so Talkback Assign, we're going to move along. On the screen, I've put a diagram that I got from the manual, and it's on page 94. There's 2 pages that I always encourage people. I know a lot of people don't like reading user manuals, but there's 2 pages that are really good to read, and it's the page on your Talkback and monitoring, because it explains just how it works, and I feel these features are so powerful in this console, and having a good understanding of how they work makes our lives a lot easier and gets us in a position where we can really get value out of the console. So one thing it's good to see here is that monitor A, B, and the headphones, the diagram's exactly the same. I'm going to come back to this at some stage as well. But this in solo, out solo, and the Talkback Return that I'm going to talk about now, which is also under our Talkback feature, is a hard patch into our monitor bus. And then at the bottom, There's left, right, and center. This will make more sense when you also see the buttons, and there's user A and B. And we can then decide whether we want to flip between the switch that allows us to monitor left, right, center, or user A and B. The next thing I want to talk about, so I'm back on the offline editor. It's good to make that full screen. Is this feature at the right bottom here, is Talkback Return. So this is an insert into our Talkback bus. And it can be on all three. It can be on monitor A or B and headphones or any of them. This is normally where I would return my front of house engineer when I'm mixing monitors, or the front of house engineer where he would return his the monitor engineer. We can also use this to bring comms in. The important thing to know about this is that it's different from all the other buses coming into our monitor bus. I know this is a lot to take in, but it will make a lot of sense in a moment. So this is where, on the console, where the Talkback bus is located. At the top, we've got three rotaries. They're called Solo Blend, Solo Trim, and the headphone out. Then the setup button, which we're going to go into now, and then this fader. The fader is dual. It's got a dual function. It changes the level of the specific bus, and if we want to go to the second bus, we have to push the button at the bottom here, which is monitor B. So for instance, how I would normally set it up, monitor A is always my in-ears when I'm mixing monitors, and then monitor B will be my Q wedge. And then if I want to use headphones, the levels here. Here's the button we call Solo Trim, and Solo Blends there. I will go through each of these functions. So we're going to go into the setup of the monitor bus. It's this menu here. Just to help us have a bit of a close-up, we're going to look at the offline editor again. So as you can see, same as the diagram, we've got monitor A, we've got monitor B, and headphones. And the settings for all of them are basically exactly the same. Far left, we've got a feature called PFL, AFL, and Auto, lovely feature. And on the output, we can decide whether we want PFL or AFL. Great, so I'm going to get my multi-track going here. It's always better to hear it. So the first feature I want to just talk about under this menu is the feature called Auto. So it auto selects whether we're using PFL or AFL. How does it do that? When we select one channel,
well, you
can see, even though, so we're looking at this lady, she's called guest 2, I've just labeled it G2. Regardless of whether I'm moving the fader up and down, nothing's happening there, so it means it's automatically selected PFL. When I multi-select, so multi-select, you select the first button, and then while holding in the first button, you can then add into more solos or more select buttons to have multiple channels selected. So what has changed now is that it's automatically gone to AFL. And we can actually see at the top the AFL button is now lit.
Are they anywhere in the world? All hotels do.
So when I'm moving the faders up and down, we're listening post-fade. This is something, once you get used to it, you don't want to work any other way. The reason is, if this, for instance, say these guest channels were toms, we'll be able to PFL tom 1, do an EQ and compression, and do the panning. I like to pan my toms quite hard. And then when we're adding in all 4 toms, for instance, we will now be able to listen to where the toms are panned with the EQ and compression that we've done. So a very quick way, it means we don't have to go back into that menu. Obviously, you can force it under that section. You can change it if you want and force it to only be AFL, PFL to fit your application. But if you understand how it works, it actually works really well. When it comes to outputs, you have to choose manually AFL or PFL. Great. Solo in place. So what Solo in place does, this is a tool for our front of house engineer. This allows us, when we solo something, you'll see every other channel is now muted. And it's soloing that specific channel over the left and right. So at the moment, I have my console set up as a monitor engineer, so none of my channels are going left and right. But in simple terms, that's how it works. So if you're mixing front of house and you just quickly want to go into, for instance, the bass, and instead of now having to mute everything and then select it, you can now just select that tool called Solo in Place. If you don't solo anything for a few minutes, then it will deselect by itself. This is obviously not something that we want to accidentally forget on during the show. Great. There's a feature called auto cancel. Also a lovely feature when you get used to it. So when we select whether we doing multi-select or just a specific range or channel, we obviously always have to hit solo clear to clear that solo. When auto select is on, we can select our first channel, then add more channels into that specific solo, and then push any select button to clear it, which helps especially on the bigger consoles when you're standing in front of bank one and you're quite far away. It's quite nice to be able to do that. Obviously, we can switch it off because sometimes on a smaller surface, we would like to select solos over different layers, which means now it becomes tricky because we can't hold the first one in. So we'll have to unselect it and then add in our solos, go to our other layer, and there we go. In this scenario, obviously, we're going to have to hit solo clear to get out. So maybe one of the features that makes a lot more sense on maybe the 3000, 5000, 7000, so on, but nevertheless, a good one to understand and use. Then we're going to quickly look at our monitor setup page, the bottom here. Oh, sorry, mute safe. Can't skip that over. Mute safe allows us to use the select button to put these channels in mute safe. What that means is, let's quickly demo that. I'm going to go to my top layer here, put some playback coming in. When I select these channels, so this is our whole panel, all our comedians, I'll select it. And then I'm going to go back to the setup, unselect it. When I now select the mute group, that mutes, it's mute group 1, all these channels, the audio will still pass.
Somewhere in which I've rented a villa or something, and then I take forage over.
So it doesn't apply to you switching the on button on and off. If you do this, the audio will stop, but it does apply to your mutes and the ons and offs on your VCA. Great. I'm going to just undo that because for later demo, this needs to be off. Great. Monitor setup. Monitor setup refers to these two buttons here. So if you can remember from the diagram that we just looked at, the left, right, and left, center, right, this is the center channel, and this Talkback return is a hard feed into each of these monitor channels. It then also gives us the option of having 2 additional inserts. But when you start up the console, they are not assigned to anything. These are stereo, each of them, and you can choose either or. And either or of the 2 users, and when you select one of them, as you can see, it deselects left and right. So the application here is when you want to bring additional signals that needs to be monitored on the console, but you don't need to monitor them all the time. So what I have often used these buttons for is when I'm doing a ceremony, say it's an award ceremony, and I'm mixing monitors, then obviously there's certain periods when we are off air in the venue and we may be doing a changeover, but now it's very difficult to follow the script because we don't know what's happening on air. There's maybe an ad break, or they're doing an interview with someone in the foyer and we don't know about it. So the complication that comes in then for the monitor engineers, we don't know when to make a certain cue live. We need to be able to follow it, but this is not something we want to listen to all the time. So I would very often, especially when we're busy with rehearsals, I would ask the OB van who's doing the broadcast to give me the on-air feed. So in this case, I've just patched channel 1 and 2 out of my Mac, and I've patched a little bit of music in there. And that would represent the feed that's on air. I've also made another little tag here called comms. I don't always listen to the comms that goes on backstage, but during rehearsals, it is quite handy to know if we're on hold or if they're looking for someone. I would patch it there and have it available to use if I need to. How do we set that up? We have to go into monitor setup. It's this blue button here. I can give it a label. So label A refers to that. Label B refers to this little tag here. And then just patch it. In this case, it was local 81. And comms, we're patched to, why it's not showing my patch points, let's have a look, click here. 3. Great. So the other option we also have is if there's a specific bus we don't want to be able to solo, we can deselect it. So, for instance, if there's aux 24 and we don't want to listen to it at any stage, we can then deselect it. So when we solo it, it won't go to the solo bus. Okay, when we look at the top here, we can now decide whether we want to listen to left and right and center. So in a scenario where you're the front of house engineer and you've got near fields, obviously this is the configuration that you're going to use. Whenever you use near fields, you need to delay it. At the bottom here is where we switch on the delay. It applies to all 3 our buses. We can also decide on the format whether left is left and right is right, or we want to turn them around, left and right, turn around. We can also go left needs to go both go to left and right, and the other way around, and do a mono sum, which is handy. So if you've got, say for instance, you use monitor B for your cue wedge, but you only have 1 wedge and not 2, but there's stereo wedges on stage, you'll obviously need to just mono sum them there, in that configuration there. Then we can, in general, as a global setting, decide whether we want to listen or solo inputs or just outputs, and then obviously our Talkback return, which in this case I've set to be my front of house engineer. I've got some playback actually coming in that represents that. We'll do that, look at that in the demo. So for each of these buses, we can then do one setup and have monitor B and A follow, or we can do a separate one for all of them. So for instance, if this is our Q wedge, and we don't want to solo inputs ever, but only outputs, we'll do it like that. If I want to use my Q wedge for a talkback ring, so say in a scenario where the monitor engineer, the front of house engineer, wants to talk to someone on stage that doesn't have in-ears in, we can put the console in this configuration and just lift up our master on B, which means the front of house now has got a direct connection to our wedge. Whenever we solo anything on the console here, it will not affect that bus at all because solo in and solo out is both being unticked. Another scenario, and this has actually happened to me, was the choreographer needed to quickly talk to someone at front of house, but I was busy mixing. So what I did is I gave him my headphones and I put the console in this configuration. So now there was a direct connection between front of house and the headphones, and it wasn't affecting me at all. So a very quick way to change the configuration. Once you've set it up, very easy to manipulate and change. This is normally the configuration that I run. I'll explain why in a moment when we do the demo. So the next thing we want to look at is a feature called Solo Blend. I've put a slide in there, just a close-up of how the monitor signal flow has been put together. I've put an arrow there because this is something that we don't, it's not been indicated. But there's a button called Solo Blend, and it's right at the top here. This allows us to make a mix between what we've currently soloed, whether it's a channel, and whatever is coming in on any of these selections, whether it's left or right, center, or one of these users, which is very valuable when we've got a complex talkback configuration. So for instance, what I've done at the moment is I've brought in my talkback, all my talkback as separates onto the console, and I'm sending all of them to left, to my center channel. So Solo Blend, just how this works is, and actually I think the best way to demonstrate this is what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that. So this is the music coming in on my on-air button. So this is basically what, in my broadcast scenario, what my OB band would be playing out. As soon as I select an input channel, my monitoring is jumping there. When I clear my solo, we go back to what we've selected on any of those. The interesting scenario that often happens when you are mixing or you're the monitor engineer in a complex show. Say it's a show where there's bands, but there's also presenters. There's an element of the show that's going to an OB band that's being broadcast. There's playback coming from that specific OB band. And obviously there's a talkback happening within the room and then also between monitor land and front of house. The monitor engineer needs to be able to follow what's happening in all those scenarios to know where in the show we are. But when we need to do critical listening on our in-ears, we need to be able to go there, listen to an input, or listen to a bus,
I'm not doubting what you get.
And still be able to decide what of the other signals we want to hear. So this is what Solo Blend allows us to do. It allows us to listen, obviously, to only the one or both, and it works like this. So I'm going to quickly select this is the mix going to David. So just to recap, these are our buses, these are our inputs. So the scenario that I've set up here, it's a talk show, and each person in the talk show's got their own mix and their own set of in-ears. So David, Lee, Rob are our presenters, and then we've got 4 guests. So seven people with 7 sets of in-ears. So at the moment I'm listening to David's bus, but when I open up the solo blend,
I had a bit of a thing about staying healthy as I got older. I thought it was important to have a routine, to have a regular.
Now we're only hearing David.
The dance of many of the leads, the dark fads that were around at the time.
So this gives us control between the two. How I've set up my console is when I do not specifically listen to a specific input or a specific bus, I only want to hear my talkback. Just before we go into the demo, there's this button I want to talk about. It's called Solo Trim. This helps us in a scenario where there's a specific mix that is so much louder than all the other mixes. So say for instance, we did these mixes and we can quite comfortably, actually I just want to undo this, we can quite comfortably listen to all of them without having to bump the monitor level up and down. So they're all kind of built similarly, but we've got one person whose mix is way louder than all the other ones. So it's the scenario. This person has asked for a lot more. So what's happening here is,
it's not other places.
Whenever I solo that specific bus, I need to pull my monitor level back.
Where?
Some of the Greek countries you'll find a difficulty.
Because at the moment it's a good 8 dBs louder than all the other buses. So you're always in the scenario we need to pull it back. And for anyone who's mixed in-ears, the more consistent you can mix, the better your mixes tend to be. Your ears climatize, obviously, after a while, and it's the annoyance of having to ride this, but it's also what's happening in your brain between mixes that are completely offset. One's being very loud and some being very soft. There's a few artists that I mix for, they like really, really soft mixes, and it actually bothers me because I've set up my system to work a certain way, and they actually force me to push my monitor fader quite high, which interferes with how the signal's going between the console and the transmitter of those specific in-ears. So the console's got a way of remedying that. It's called Solo Trim. When I select my specific bus that are too loud, I can now trim it back by that amount. I'm guessing it's about, so there's nothing happening to the metering or the outputs. The output's still the same.
So just enjoy it. I read The Guardian.
Read The Guardian with your half alarm.
But you can hear now the difference between those buses are not nearly as big anymore. When I take it off, you'll hear there's a significant difference between those two. So what you can do is you can build your mixes, and those mixes that are way softer or way louder, we can then compensate with this trim. So they're all the same level, which allows us then to leave our master bus in one position. Once again, this is helping with our mixing, focusing on the mix and not on riding unnecessary stuff. Then there's also very, very handy, especially when you're mixing music and you're the monitor engineer. What very often happens is that you are listening into a bus. Let's say it's David's bus, and we are working to get David happy, and then David would say, I can't hear playback. So I need to now go, say, to another channel, say it's on this layer, hypothetically it's on this layer, and I go listen into that channel. And then you can go like, ooh, but there's no playback playing, for instance, if that was our playback channels. What often happens is I select that bus there. When I select another channel, it drops my solo bus, which means
Any of the
I'm listening there. Now I need to go somewhere else. As soon as I select that, I've dropped that solo. Now I want to go back to David and tell him, listen, sir, there's no playback happening at the moment, and I need to reselect that. Going back and forth a mix that you are busy working on will waste a huge amount of time. So there's a button here called Input Priority. Once you select that, it allows you to select a mix bus, an aux, then select an input. So say we want to select the ambient. Once we deselect, it goes back to the bus that we were working on. This becomes extremely valuable when we're in this scenario here, where we may be looking at a VCA and we're listening into David's bus, and now we want to go and just listen to another channel.
All hotels do have.
Right.
That's not the bit with
When we deselect our channel selection, it goes back
There's a breakfast food. I don't see which of these three things is.
to the bus that we've previously been working on. So in the scenario where the monitor engineer is busy building mixes for these people, it saves us a huge amount of time reselecting a bus that we are already working on. So that's input priority. It's right at the top there. Lovely feature. Great. Okay, so in the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to just explain my approach. This is for all the monitor engineers. Hopefully there's something you can use. This is kind of my tricks and methods that I've figured out over the last few years that I believe that's important to being a good and proficient monitor engineer. So just a few tips that I feel is important, and I know we often talk about this, but I can't state this too much, is just the whole idea of gain control and how much gain you are taking and how consistent you are in doing that. There's a reason why I'm saying this, because it affects a monitor engineer in a massive way when you are working with a huge amount of channels. So often the show that I showed you right in the beginning there, it's normally about 120 to 128 channels, roughly. So I normally spend my VI 5 or 7,000, and we normally have between 20 and 24 artists, and I end up between 70 and 100 snapshots for a 2.5-hour show. So it's a very heavy workload. And what I found is the better the gain structure is, the better my mixing actually ends up being. The reason is when we have gain structure and channels and our mixes start looking like that, our fader positions become weird. The faders are in weird places, and where our hands are sitting on the console is becoming unnatural. Also, if the gain is pulled this hot, small little changes will actually mess up an in-ear mix quite easily. So it sounds like you know, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but very importantly, it's very important to make sure our gain structure, especially when you're mixing monitors, are as good and as even as possible between our different sources, regardless of what the source is. If we can get all our signals to hit the same place, whether it's 0 or +6 on this console is very forgiving when it comes to pulling gains. It's going to save us a huge amount of time having to fetch faders from here. The other thing that I've also realized is if the gains are pulled really well and you're mixing post-fade, like this, what happens is that the amount of travel on the channels is a lot less. So normally what will happen is the gains will settle over time, and we'll most probably end up with a mix that looks fairly flat, like this. If you're mixing post-fade, and I believe when mixing monitors, regardless of whether you've set these channels, so I know some people when they mix in-ears, and I also sometimes do it, I'll have my signals going to my in-ears as pre-fade and my signals going to my monitors as post-fade for obvious reasons. I would always mix in this configuration where every single channel is on 0. Because if you're mixing a festival and you're going to be grinding the console for 5 or 7 days, each time the fade is doing this, it's doing a huge amount of travel. And for anyone who's lost faders in a festival scenario, it is a painful experience, especially because we're losing, obviously, this fader over every single bank. So for the longevity of a console, when you're mixing monitors and you're mixing quite fast and you're going between channels, mixing post-fade in this post-fade configuration where the channels are all on 0 puts a lot less stress on the faders. That's one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing I always do as well is I do set up VCAs regardless of whether I'm going to use them or not, because they double up obviously as mute groups. And on this console, the feature that I've mentioned is Aux Vca Mode. Basically what it is, for anyone who's missed it, on this console we have a VCA in its normal configuration. So say we were mixing front of us, and we obviously this is set to our presenters. If we're making this loud and softer, we are making our presenters loud and softer. This console also gives us a VCA within each aux. Let me explain. So now we're listening to David.
No, I don't do that.
If I go back to VCAs, you'll see my VCAs have turned white. If I pull this down, you'll see this VCA is now controlling the levels within that aux send. Why is this important? It's important when you've got a console that's populated with 100 channels and the artist asks you to bring everything down excluding their vocal. And then a very quick way of doing that, without now doing weird things where you're pushing your master or pulling your master back, or pulling the master back and pushing that send, which messes up your gain structure. What you can do is you build a VCA for that from the get-go, and we do it like this. So let's say it's going to be VCA 8, we set a button, VCA 8, and we say we want to include everything, every single channel on the console into this VCA, and we only want to exclude our vocals. That's it, done. We switch on Aux Vca Mode, give it a name, you can call it all Xbox. Oops, bad spelling, but anyway, we're there. Take out the setup button. So this is muting and controlling every single channel on the console except the vocals. So if you're mixing an orchestra and you've got a band and you spend every single channel on that console and the vocal asks, can you please bring everything down by 3 dB, which very often happens. Now it's very easy to do that. You select the mix, you go back to the VCAs and you take off 5 dB there, and you're ready to go. You can also ISO that if you need. Great. That's why I say rather build VCAs you're not going to need than need VCAs you haven't built. So those are things that I always do. Something else that's also good to know is how we do Talkback configuration. So very often I'm in a scenario where I'm actually running out of buses. This happens to me very, very often, and I have to be very careful on how I'm spending my groups or my auxes, because I just have enough, or I'm already in a situation where I need to make compromises on effects or whatever the case might be. So whenever you're mixing monitors, there's 3 buses that you never use, which is our left, right, and center. So I always start my setup, Talkback setup, using these. which might sound a little bit unorthodox, but once you see how I've set it up, it will make a lot more sense. So my configuration looks like this. I have solo in, solo out in, and then also my Talkback Return, which in this case is going to be my front of house engineer. And I have selected the center to be part of what's coming into monitor A. Then all my Talkback channels are brought onto my console and I've isolated them. You can see they're all purple. The ones I'm using at the moment is these two. It might be a little bit small for you to read on this top view. The first one is my Talkback Mic. Right. 222. And it is direct out. A is 1, and it comes into the next channel as A is 1. The reason I've done that is because I wanted to apply EQ and compression. 222, so it comes in there. Yep, and then the signal coming in here, as you can hear, has been EQ'd. 222, 122, and it's got some compression on. That is then the signal that I am using on my Talkback source. That's the one reason I do it. The other reason I bring the Talkback onto the console, this also allows me then to send these Talkback sources to different places and use a mute group to control that. If you set up your VCAs, you probably won't need any mute groups because the VCAs are there to do the mutes. So then you can use a mute group to elaborate on your Talkback. So I've used these two inputs, which is just to be fancy. You can obviously just use one, but with one mic and one input, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Talkback destinations. So I can talk separately to front of us, to my drummer, to my presenters, to my guest artists, and to my technical crew. And then I've used this channel with a mute group that sends to my right fader, and that is talking to my band. The scenario that I'm replicating here is we've got 2 monitor engineers. I'm mixing monitors for all the vocalists, and there's another monitor engineer that mixes for the band, but I very often need to talk to them, so I use this configuration here. This also allows me to talk to a performer or artist or technical crew at the same time by doing that. Okay. Then the other thing I've done is I've brought all my Talkback channels on here, regardless of whether I'm going to use them or not. So I've got my comms. Let's quickly look at the offline editor. This might be worth to see. So I've got my Talkback dry, Talkback with the EQ. I've got a tone in, I'll explain why. I've got my comms coming in. So this is backstage comms, actually artist comms. So this is my runners that will go fetch my artists if they need to, and they are basically running the show. I normally don't want to hear them. I do take the signal in because during rehearsals, it's good to know when we're on a break or when we're holding for someone or someone's running late. Then these all are all engineers. In this case, it's the playback, my Talkback. It's the front of house engineer, another monitor engineer. And then there was a sub mixer with all my technical crew on a Talkback ring, and it's this fader here. What I've done is all these channels I've assigned to center, and under monitoring page, center is assigned to monitor A. So when I haven't soloed anything or my solo blend is turned down, I can hear what's happening on center channel, and it sounds like this. So it's mostly in Afrikaans, and if it's English and there's sarcasm, I apologize. So as you can hear, this can very quickly become quite chaotic, but because you've got it in the console now, it's very easy to manipulate it. I can then decide I don't want to hear the text. No, they're off. Or I don't want to hear the front of house engineer, and now it's off. It's very easy to manipulate. The other thing as well, because I'm using this fader right here, when they're chattering and I don't want to hear them, I can just switch it off there. It's right next to my master fader, my monitor fader. So there they are, and now they're gone. The other thing to remember as well, this is I'm only hearing this talkback while I'm not soloing or not mixing. The rest of the time they're quiet. For instance, if I have to go and listen to the ambient, for instance, they are gone. When I listen to a specific guest speaking,
I just enjoy it. I read The Guardian while I'm listening.
as soon as I clear, I'm back to my talkback. Okay. So this allows me to do a submix into my in-ears and decide how loud it is. The other thing I like about this is I can EQ and compress it to my liking, and I can even, when I'm programming my show, I can program this into snapshots. So when I'm in my holding scene, going into my first act, I can, for instance, have a configuration where I am listening to the comms really loud, for instance, like that. So I can hear what's happening backstage. As soon as I recall my first snapshot, I can kill it. There's another reason why I've started doing it this way, is I've learned that the more control I have over what's happening mix-wise, and as less time as I can spend spending time on talkback. What often happens is when in rehearsal, and now I need to quickly have a listen to what's happening on the comms. Now I have to talk to the comms engineer to send me that signal so I can understand what's happening, or maybe they're struggling with a guitar. All that stuff is taking away from what we are here to do, which is mixing and do the best mix for the artist as possible. So if I can have control over it and I can manipulate it quite quickly, it saves time for me. Also, if I can program scenarios that's going to help me in the show and know where in the show I am, or pick up on something that's maybe going wrong backstage. So for instance, an artist has lost its mic, which means we're going to go to a backup microphone. If I've got that information beforehand, I can remedy the problem before it's a problem. So if I can see, oh my word, something's going wrong, let's quickly have a listen to what's happening on comms, I can very quickly just lift up my fader and go at comms channel. Okay, cool. That's where we're at. There's another reason why I do this, and this is a newer trick. And the last thing I'm going to talk about today is that we've got this feature called Vmix, right? So Vmix is an auto mix feature, and the thing about comms and the reason why it's always a big problem is because people tend to get emotional on comms, and you often need to go back to the comms engineer and ask them to make someone louder or softer or whatever the case might be. So it would be nice if someone is mixing it. So I use my Vmix feature. In this case, I'm using Vmix 2 to mix this for me. So I'm just going to skip somewhere to where the guys are all talking.
Well done, guys.
So for instance, there was someone talking on the tech line just now. All the faders are closed now because no one's talking. Someone's standing next to the bass amps. You can see that little fader's open. There we go. So what's happening is, as the guys are talking, it's only opening that channels and then closing the ones that are not being talked on. Then there's one other scenario that often happens is because the comms are coming from everywhere, you've got a lot of noise. It's lifting the noise floor on your mix bus, which over time is obviously not good. You want, when we're not mixing, we want it as quiet as possible for our ears to rest, especially when we're mixing long shows. So what I've done is I put a test tone, the oscillator, on this tone channel. I add in an oscillator, and I just don't assign it anywhere. So when there's no one talking and the threshold of that specific channel is higher than the noise, it's basically muting the noise.
Want to ek hoor myself. Jy kan die MC's by daai my left afstuur. Want to ek hoor hulle nie.
There we go. So you can see what's happening there on the tech line is there's audio coming in, but because there's no voice, the tone channel, this tone is now closing all those faders. So it's just a nice little trick. Just a nice little trick that I've used, and it works really well. Maybe a little bit of a different approach on managing your monitoring, but it works really well for me. I just want to mention, you don't have to use the left and right, obviously, because on the console, we do have these user inputs, and they can be patched to be anything. So you can do this whole same configuration using an aux or a matrix, if you please. But yeah, and I think I'm out of time. If there's any questions, I will take them now.
All right, we do have some questions here.
Oh, lovely.
All right. The first question is, in the solo section, is PFL pre or post EQ?
PFL is post EQ. Yeah, so you PFL it and you still be able to hear your EQ and compression.
All right, the next question, when soloing channels, is there a trim between inputs and outputs? Usually inputs are a lot louder, or would you trim up all your outputs to match input levels?
You can do that, yes. So obviously depends on what you're going to do with your monitor setup. Obviously, if you're using it on auto mode, you need to remember whenever you're selecting one channel, it's always going to be pre-fade. So that specific channel will be louder. So I guess you can trim it up. Something that I've also found, and I forgot to mention it now, is, and this is probably one of the biggest tricks when it comes to mixing monitors, is slightly related to this topic, is that I always calibrate all my outputs. So I would make sure that when I'm hitting, for instance, 0 on my metering, that I would also hit the same level on the metering on the in-ear transmitter. In-ear transmitters, for some reason, don't all have the same sensitivity, so you'll find between manufacturers there's quite a big difference. So you can trim it up. I prefer to hear as close as possible to what the artist is hearing. So I would physically go to each pack, listen to them, and then calibrate it to my pack to know that they are all sounding the same. But you can use the feature to trim it up, yes.
Okay, it looks like those were the only 2 questions. If anybody has an additional question, if you want to send it in the chat box, we can get to that. And in the meantime, I'm going to send a couple of links to all of you. These are links we frequently get asked about. So if you look in the chat window right now, the first link is a link to our Harman Professional University training, where you can find information about our certification courses and other content. The second link is to our recorded playlist. So this session and all sessions, the webinars that we've done, have been put out onto a YouTube channel on a playlist. And the third link is to our calendar that shows all of the upcoming webinars. So if you have interest in attending any of the future webinars, the whole list is out there. We do have another question.
Awesome.
How does the oscillator setup rest your ears?
In my explanation of how I did the monitoring setup. So what I'm doing is the oscillator, sorry, I know this is kind of a weird concept. It's not resting my ears in the sense of that I'm listening to it. I'm using it as a tool to close my talkback when there's only ambient. So what I've done is all these channels, all my talkback channels, so in this case it's comms and it's Gabs, Murray, PF, and Tech Talk. All these channels are sending to left and right, to center, and the center is coming into monitor A right there, which means when I haven't soloed anything, this is what we're listening to. So these selections here is, in essence, what we're listening to when nothing is solar. So for instance, if I go onto on air, we're going to hear music, right? If we go to center, we're going to hear talkback when there is talkback on that channel. So what will happen in this scenario is that often there's a huge amount of ambient spill. And especially during rehearsal time, because everyone's got their talkbacks open and comms are going, and you can't switch this off because you need to follow the rehearsal to know where we are. So this ambient buildup becomes fairly hectic. So what I do is I insert the oscillator as one of my channels, and I push up the fader, same as you would do with a gate, till it closes the ambient. So it's just a little workaround trick. It's not like when I'm listening to tone. The tone is not even rooted anyway. I'm just using it within the Vmix mixer to have something that is always louder than my ambient spill.
Okay, we had another question related to access to this webinar recording. As I mentioned in the link that I sent to you, we have a YouTube channel where all of these sessions go. This session will probably be posted in 2 or 3 days. So if you check out on the playlist, you'll see it up there. And Gabriel's other 2 sessions are already posted, so you can access those as well. And it looks like that's it for questions.
Awesome.
Gabriel, did you have contact? Yep, up on the screen right now.
Yeah.
If you have additional questions for Gabriel, you can reach out to him on the email address that he has listed. It's up on the screen presently. And Gabriel, thank you so much for doing all of these sessions. They were really valuable to everybody who attended, so we appreciate that.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Yes, awesome. Thank you. Keep well.